Okay, so at this point we have our simulation, and the next thing is going to be for us to go from this to this. So this means that I'm just going to quickly go over this setup that I used for rendering this scene. Everything was rendered with V-Ray. This is not going to be an in-depth introduction to V-Ray. I made a course specifically for that you can find at CG Circuit as well. So this is the course, and this will go over pretty much everything you need to know about V-Ray for Houdini. And so in this workshop, I'm not going to cover the same contents that you have here, but this is available for you as well. I'm also not going to recreate everything from scratch. I'm going to be importing a lot of elements that I use for rendering that scene. So let's first check our geometry. In terms of shading the tire, if you go into your geometry and you select, you can even select the alembic and go to the geometry spreadsheet. If you go to primitives, you'll see that everything has a material assigned to it already. Now, what I'm going to do is import this material network that's inside this geometry container. So what I'll do is actually that. So I'll create a geometry container that's going to be called tire geo prep. And inside this geometry container, I'm actually going to paste the material network that I created on that other file. Inside this material network, you'll find all the shaders that are being used on the tire. And since we have the exact path for the shaders, when you render out the tire, V-Ray will find those shaders and it will render properly. So this doesn't need to be visible, of course. The other thing that I like to do is to separate the working containers from the rendering containers. So here on the tire import, I'm going to actually hide this, and I'm going to create a section here that's going to be just with the render elements. Let's set this aside. I'm going to create a geometry container, and all those geometry containers that are for rendering, I add this prefix. And that way, when I'm trying to select which objects I want to be renderable, I just have to type this prefix, and everything that's supposed to be rendered is going to be selected. So this is going to be the tire. I'm going to change the color, so it's also a good idea to kind of color code things. And here I'm just going to create an object merge that's going to get the tire from the tire import, and I'm going to grab the actual alembic. And as you can see, it's already finding shaders and everything, so that's working properly. I'll do the same thing for the smoke simulation. So I'll create a geometry container just for rendering the smoke. Smoke, also color coded, and here I'll do the same thing. So actually, in this case, we're loading the simulation we cached out from a file cache. So I'm just going to copy this file cache, paste it here, and we'll also need to assign a material to this. So from this point on, I'm actually going to change the layout to split bird. These are two custom layouts that I have, but they're really easy to set up. All you need to do is kind of come here and split left, right, or top, bottom, and organize as much as you want. Let's go to the camera. And so the idea is for me to have a context, material context here, and here everything else. So here I'm going to create a V-Ray volume grid shader, and this is going to be the smoke, and I'll assign it here. Okay. As for this shader, the V-Ray volume grid shader, it's actually pretty simple if you're familiar with this type of shaders. Regarding this shader, I would definitely recommend you have a look at this section of the documentation, which is volumetric rendering in depth. It doesn't matter if it's 3ds Max because the settings will be pretty much the same for whichever 3D application you're using. And but here you have some really nice examples of what each different parameter does and how it affects your rendering times, your render quality, and all that stuff. So definitely check this out. I'm not going to do anything very complex. This is a pretty simple, pretty straightforward volume shader that we're going to be using. So here on the smoke, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that the fields, I'm not going to be working with fire, so I'll disable fire. Even though I don't have color, you can leave it as is because it's fine. It's just gonna ignore. It's gonna use the color that we set out here. One thing that's pretty particular regarding the way V-Ray works with VDBs is that whenever you have a vector field on your VDB, V-Ray actually expects it to be separate in 3 separate fields, one for each axis. Instead of actually having vector information on one grid, you need to have 3 grids, one for each axis. So we're not merging the velocity for that same reason, and this is what it expects to find. Velocity is going to be important in our case because we do want to render this with motion blur. Continuing with the smoke, the other thing I'm going to change is the color. I really want to make sure that this is a bit brighter. So yeah, something like this is fine for us to start. And the other thing you'll probably want to adjust is the smoke opacity. We want this to be very transparent type of smoke. So I'm going to start with 0.05 for us to test this out. So this is just the initial setup. We can then have a look at further develop the shader and with some render testing. The other thing that we're missing here is the ground. So I'm going to create a ground, a grid actually. And I'm going to call this ground using the same prefix as before, ground. Same color coding, dive inside. So this grid, I'm going to want to have some UVs. So I'll create a UV project and just initialize it. It's always good to press spacebar 5 to check out that we do have UVs now. The other thing I want to do is I will be creating, the idea of this environment is that we have kind of a fading to dark wherever it's not the areas that are not really close to the tire kind of tend to fade to black. And instead of having a solid opacity on the whole grid object, I actually created a mask to have a radial gradient in a way that it allows us to kind of fade to transparent and fade to the black background that we have. And for that, I'm actually going to need to have a bit more geometry. This is going to be a geometry attribute that I'm going to apply. And the way I did that was through a point wrangle. I'm actually just going to copy the code. Create mask attribute. And let's just actually hide everything else. And I'm just going to copy the code. It's 2 lines of Vex, pretty straightforward. Okay, so basically what I'm doing here is I'm just using the length of the point attribute as a radius. For each point has a distance to the origin, which is where the tire is. And then I divided that by a maximum distance that I set up. That way I can normalize that distance from 0 to 1, and then I just use that normalized distance from the origin to actually use a ramp that allows me to set the gradient exactly as I want. And we can have a look at it as well. Control, middle mouse button, and then just press on the mask. And as you can see, this is just going to make sure that wherever is you see here that is red is going to appear transparent later on. So yeah, that was the setup for the grid. Finally created a material for this, so let's apply the material directly on the geometry. And I also have a material network with that already. And inside a material network, Let me just assign the material already. It's just a tarmac material based on some maps that I downloaded, some free samples that you can get from Polygon. Really high resolution, high quality maps. Nothing fancy here. So you have your diffuse, your color information. You have, I'm using, what else? I'm using reflection glossiness, a fall off for the opacity. In this case, the opacity is actually working with the distance blend instead of using the gradient that I have. And here on the gradient, I'm actually just mixing a light tarmac with a dark tarmac. So I have both things working for me, and some bump, some displacement, and that's pretty much it.